Hello folks, welcome to my YouTube channel, Watercolor Impressions. I went shopping in downtown. When I came out in this late evening, I saw this shops reflecting on the ground and the car's lights reflecting on the ground provided me a beautiful subject to paint. Before we go, hit the subscribe button so you guys can get weekly video updates from our channel. And let's get started, guys. In any watercolors, you start with a light sketch. One tip I can give you for drawing or any kind of sketch for painting is look for big major shapes, then look for medium shapes, then look for small details, and you can add more details from there. For watercolors, you try to keep the sketch lighter because sometimes the sketch might see through. It doesn't matter, but I try to keep it light, and whenever I see windows or any areas which is darker, I try to shade it. I also provide the drawing template in the video description, so please feel free to download it so you guys can follow the tutorial with me. So I always start with the sky because that's a big shape in our painting. So for the sky, I used cobalt wash, and you could see I didn't use that much water, and it's gonna get dried out pretty lighter as soon as you do it. And since it's a late evening painting, the sky is gonna be a little bit darker than compared to morning or noon painting. Before it dries out, I'm going to put a darker shape in the midground building because this is going to act as a really good a shape for the sky. So I'm going to be getting a little bit darker as possible. Like when I paint the sky, I try to connect the shapes in the background with other buildings too, because or else it will look really bad in the painting. I'm also leaving some white bits here and there for the lighting. You see I left a white bit on the left hand side, but it will make sense once why I did that. And I'm also putting a darker pigment on the building, which is on the in the middle of the painting. You will see why I did that. Even though it looks darker now, it's gonna dry out really light as it dries out. And I also started with the background building. I also want to connect that shape with the background and the sky and everything together. As a painter, it's good to connect all the shapes together, or else like things which is unconnected in the painting looks really bad. So I jumped onto the building on the left, and even though some of the buildings look a little bit different, I tried to put out my own spin in the buildings and the background. As a painter, you are telling a story, and it doesn't have to be true to your reference. You can change it however you want it until you capture the mood and you capture the lighting and the values. That's what it matters when you paint. So usually for the background buildings, I'm going with a lot of cool colors. I'm mixing a lot of Cobalt Blue, Cerulean Blue, and a little bit of neutral tint in my background buildings. But as it comes to the foreground, since it's a late evening, it's going to be reflecting a lot of sky from the reflecting from the sky. So there's going to be a lot of blue, and I'm going to mix a little bit of Payne's gray to get the grayish tone, and I'm also going to add a little bit of Winsor violet as it dries out. This is the first wash, so I'm going to keep it really light, but as it comes down, I'm going to increase the pigment consistency a little bit better so that it gives a really good lead-in for us. The sky is reflecting on the ground really strong, so for that I'm using Cobalt Blue. I usually keep it whenever I'm doing a reflection scene, I try to keep it plain as possible because we're going to have light values and darker values at the same time. Now I jumped onto the midground building. For the midground building, I'm using raw amber. Even though there is a lot of buildings there, I'm trying to change it as much as possible. But it will be good to have some kind of warm colors because there's a lot of blue in our scene, so it will give us a good complement in our painting as well. I'm using raw amber I also mix a little bit of color variations in the foreground building as well. Since they're both gonna have the same building color, so I'm going to do the exact same thing. But as it comes down, I'm going to introduce a little bit of darker pigment, so it gives a little bit of gradient in our painting in the foreground building. So I jumped onto the midground building, which is also act as a really good focal point in our painting. So I'm starting with the darker pigment at the top. For the darker pigment, I'm using Payne's gray. And I'm taking the other pigment, which is cadmium orange, and a little bit of yellow ochre in it because it kind of has this European building, and there is also a lot of light reflection there in the mid part of the building, and the rest it's kind of darker. So I'm keeping aware of it, and I'm also leaving some white bits here and there for the light coming from the building. It will make sense once we add the lights there, but I'll keep it trying not to paint over it. It also gives a little bit of contrast in our painting as well. As it comes down, I'm going to increase the consistency and the pigment consistency. So the painting, sometimes I do this, sometimes when you paint, the painting goes and settles down at the bottom. So what you could do is, the simple trick is to just flip the watercolor block or your canvas or whatever it takes to do it. Before, a while ago, whenever I painted, when I leave the watercolor painting wherever it is, and it gives some ugly marks in my painting, I hate doing that. So I usually flip my canvas sometimes, because I let watercolor does what it does, it blends by itself. And I also introducing a little bit of a darker value at the bottom of the background, so that it also illuminates light in our painting, and it gives a really good impact on our painting as well. So now let's jump on to the background building, because the background building dried out quite a bit, even though it looked darker, and my paper drying so fast. So I want to introduce a little bit of pigment consistency there to get some details here and there. Like the another tip I can give you is, whenever you do background building, not try to fuss with it. Put minimal details as much as you can, and don't fuss with it. Don't add like a lot of details or anything, and don't concentrate on the background building. I'm constantly flipping my watercolor paper. I pasted the watercolor paper on a cardboard, which is 11x17, so I can just flip it and flip the block whenever I want it. As I said, even though we put like a really darker pigment in the mid-ground building, it dried out quite a bit, so I'm going to do another glaze over. For this time, I'm going to spending a lot of darker pigment at the top, because it's going to be act as a really good a shape against our sky. And when I added the details, I don't fuss with it. I usually keep it impressionistic as possible and simple as possible when you see this painting from far, and it will give all the impressions a viewer would need for it. And now I'm focusing on the mid-ground building, and this mid-ground building has a lot of lighter values on it, but I will bring this lighter values using white paint at the end as a detailing part. And now I'm keeping this as a shape as possible. I'm trying to make sure I'm getting the shape right, and which is also connecting the shape in the foreground building. So I put a little bit of peons gray at the bottom, so the darker pigment bleeds through from the bottom to the top, and it also gives a really good arrangement for our mid-ground building and the foreground building. So now I'm focusing on the foreground building. It's kind of have a darker shape, which is facing the plane, which is facing on the other side. It also dried a bit, so I'm going to do another glaze over with the same pigment consistency. So once I'm happy with it, now we are almost at the end of all the first wash, other than the foreground building looked really white. So I'm going to focus on the foreground building white, and this is going to be super dark, as as dark as you can get, because this is going to act as a really good lead-in for us. And this also separates everything from the background to the foreground to the midground. So I'm going to get darker as possible, and I'm also a little bit worried about getting the line straight. That's why I rotated my watercolor paper, and I'm just making sure to get a crisp line as possible, because this is going to be a foreground building. I want to make sure that I get it right. You could see I'm also using a flat brush. Sometimes you could use this brush to get like a really flat shape and crisp line, so I'm using it. I don't use this brush that often, but it's really good for buildings and stuff like that. You could see I also painted a little bit of light in the shop, so that's also act as a really good detail for us at the end. So I'm also adding that door detail from the shop. And I'm also at the top, it kind of looked a little bit of gradient, so I'm trying to add that as well, since I have a darker pigment in my brush. And I'm keep building the pigment. Even though it looks darker now, this pigment gets drier as possible too. The light which I painted earlier also got light as well, so I'm adding a little bit of I use Winsor orange and a little bit of cadmium orange in it, or else I use cadmium yellow for adding the lights like that. And there is also two windows at the top, but since it's in a shadow, I want to make sure it doesn't read as much as like other things in our painting. So now I'm starting the people in the mid-ground building, in the mid-ground shape, and I'm going to connect this people from the background to the mid-ground to the foreground. And I'm trying to keep it as simplistic as possible. You would be surprised how less you have to paint in a painting to get the impressions you want. So as soon as we added it, you could see it gives an impression of people walking towards us in the painting. We are slowly approaching to the end of our painting. The only things left in our painting would be adding the foreground reflections and lighting, and then we are at the final stage of our painting. Let's start with the cars. For the cars, still, even though I'm painting quite a bit, and still I struggle with one of the really complicated thing to paint is cars. I don't know, like it just have to look like a car when you paint, you know, that's all I can say. Other than that, like I think the more cars you do, the more comfortable you get. The cars are really good for scale in our painting. It also helps us to create mood in our painting too, because it has light in it, so it reflects on the ground, it reflects on anywhere else, you know, the object near us. So I'm starting with the mid-ground road, which is on the right hand side. So for that I'm using a little bit of Winsor violet. Now it's all about adding lights in our painting. You can see I also add a little bit of lighting, which is on the mid-ground building. You could see I used Winsor orange, and sometimes I use Indian yellow. That also gives a really good reflections. But so whenever you paint reflections or light, you could do it two ways. You can paint the light first, then you can add the darker tone, or also you can add the darker tone, then you can add the lighting. So this is this technique is depends on artist, however you want it, and this takes a little bit, quite a bit to get a grasp of it. When I started doing it, I had a really hard time getting the reflections right or the lighting right, but once I got used to it, then as I did more paintings, I got really comfortable with. I'm just adding like wherever I see lights, I'm just adding that. Since I have a blue paint, I'm also throwing the colors here and there just to get a little bit of lighting in the painting. I'm going to start with the light which is in the foreground. For that I'm using cadmium yellow and a little bit of Indian yellow and a little bit of white paint in my brush. It looks a little bit lighter. This is just to see where the lighting goes. I also went ahead and skipped this step. I just like add a little bit of darker tones on top of the lighting I painted. Now it's a matter of adding a little bit of mid-tones where the people are reflecting on the mid-ground. So this one you can increase the pigment consistency a little bit better, because you know we want a darker pigment as much as possible. So this is like pure pigment without no water in my brush, so that I can get as dark as possible. So now I'm going to adding a little bit of darker tone at the bottom of the car. It's really important to add that detail at the bottom of the car because it anchors the car on the ground. And you can also see there's a road which is on the right hand side. I'm also adding that platform using Payne's gray. So now the people in the foreground, I'm adding the reflections. In the reference it looks totally different, but I'm trying to mix it up impressionistic as possible and simplistic as possible. But at the end of the day, once you finish the painting, it's gonna look really good. So now I'm adding the reflection for the car, which is reflecting all the way to the foreground. The mid-ground cars doesn't reflect as much as the foreground element. And I also added two persons, which is on the right hand side, because that side looked really weak. So I also add the reflection for that people as well. So now I'm just trying to increase the pigment consistency in the foreground reflections. So this process is keep on building the pigment until you're happy with it. There is no right or wrong way for it. I'm also trying to adding reflections for some of the objects which is on the right hand side. So now the same process, I took the white paint and I painted the other lights in our scene, and I have red paint in my brush, so I'm going to do the exact same thing in all of the parts of my painting as well. So I took a white paint, I also painted the street lines, and I also painted a little bit of detail at the top on the right hand side of our building. The foreground building dried quite a bit, so I'm going to be glazing over with a darker pigment on the brush, and I want to get as dark as possible. And now I'll start building this darker pigment until I'm happy with my values. For that, I'm using cadmium orange, a little bit of Payne's gray in my brush. I'm also taking that darker pigment, also trying to anchor that ground on the foreground ground. And that's it, folks. And we are almost at the end of our painting journey. Take my drawing template and my reference from my website, and let's see what you can come up with. Thanks again for watching this video tutorial with me. Let me know what you guys learned from this video and what's your favorite color in this painting. If you have any other questions or subjects you want me to cover in watercolors, write me at watercolorimpressions@gmail.com or comment below. Before you go, hit the subscribe button so you guys can get weekly video updates from our channel. And please do share with your friends and family. And good luck with your painting, folks.